The sky over the Arizona territory was the color of a fresh bruise, a sickly yellow-green that pressed down on the red dust of the salt cedar wash. It was the color of silence, the color of held breath. This was the hour before the sandstorm, when the world went still, waiting for the first cut of the wind. Rowan Pike felt the pressure change in his bones. He stood alone in the vast emptiness, a solitary figure against the expanse of his hard-won farm. He was a young man, but the land had already taken its toll, carving lines of worry around his eyes that matched the dry crevices of the wash. His mother was long gone, and the silence of the cabin behind him was a familiar weight. He worked, hammering a split wooden brace back onto the frame of his water lift, his movements economical and practiced. Sweat cut clean lines through the mask of red grit on his face. Every strike of the hammer was a punctuation mark in the heavy quiet. He needed this lift. Water was the only god worth praying to in this territory, and the storm would either try to tear the lift apart or bury the wellhead in 6 feet of sand. He paused, wiping his forehead with his forearm, leaving a dark smear. He tasted salt and iron. That was when he saw them. They did not approach on the path. They emerged from the shimmering heat and the spiky protection of the yucca grove, as if the desert itself had birded them. 3 women, Apache. The hammer stopped mid-swing. The air, already thin, seemed to vanish from his lungs. They were a portrait of exhaustion and defiance, moving as one unit, their bodies leaning into each other for support. They wore the remnants of buckskin dresses and trade-cloth shawls, torn and powdered with the same red dust that covered Rowan's land. The one in the lead, the eldest, was Dasi. She was tall, her face a mask of stoic calm, but her eyes were sharp as freshly knapped flint. They moved over the farm, the mule, the half-fixed lift, and finally, they settled on him. They were the eyes of a hunter, assessing threat and opportunity in a single glance. The woman she supported, Maya Lu, favored one leg, her face tight with pain. Her ankle was swollen, angry and dark beneath the hem of her dress. The third, the youngest, was Tisa. She was quick, bird-like, her head constantly moving. She scanned the ridgelines, the shadow of the barn, the roof of the cabin. She was the sentinel, and her hand rested on the bone handle of a knife at her waist. Rowan did not move. He did not breathe. He and the women were suspended in the dead air. He knew the rules of this land. A lone man, 3 Apache women. This was a situation that usually ended in blood, slowly, deliberately. Rowan Pike lowered his hammer and placed it on the wooden frame. He did not let it drop. He placed it. He straightened, turning his body slightly to show he was not angling for the rifle he kept leaning just inside the stable door. Then, he raised his hands, palms forward, empty. They were 30 paces apart. Maybe 35. A chasm of suspicion separated them. The first real gust of the storm chose that moment to arrive, sweeping across the yard. It kicked up a sheet of fine sand, a ghostly curtain that shimmered between them, obscuring and revealing them in pulsing waves. The women stopped. The leader, Dasi, took one step forward, leaving her sister's support. Her voice, when it came, was like stones rattling in a dry gourd. It was broken English, but the meaning was absolute, each word bitten off and spat out with a controlled fury. Water. She gestured not to the well, but to her own mouth. A quick, angry tap. Bandages. She pointed to her sister's injured leg. Then, her eyes locked with Rowan's, and the flint struck sparks. Do not lay hands on anyone. It was not a request. It was a condition, a threat. Rowan held her gaze for a beat. He gave a single, slow nod. Keeping his hands visible, he turned and pointed one finger down. At the wellhead beside the lift, he walked to the bucket, his boots making no sound in the soft dust. He worked the rope, the creak of the pulley abnormally loud in the electric air. He felt their eyes on his back, a physical pressure, like the points of 3 knives. He pulled the brimming bucket up, the water inside it dark and precious. He did not carry it to them. He did not gesture for them to approach. He carried the bucket to a spot halfway between his stable and where they stood, setting it down on a flat, sun-baked stone that marked the edge of his workable yard. The water sloshed, precious drops darkening the red earth. Then he backed away, moving slowly, not turning his back again until he reached the deep shadow of the stable. He leaned against the warm wood, folding his arms, making himself small, non-threatening. He was giving them the well. He was giving them the yard. The three women watched him. The youngest, Tessa, whispered something fast and low in their own tongue. The injured one, Maya-Lu, just nodded, her eyes wide with pain and fear, never leaving Rowan's figure in the shadows. Dasi waited. She scanned the entire farm again. She looked for a dog that was not there, for movement in the cabin window, for the sign of another man. She found only stillness. A deep, heavy silence descended, thick with exhaustion and distrust. It was a standoff of man and knives, of water and sand. Everything was motionless, caught in the yellow calm before the inevitable violence of the storm. A low rumble shook the ground. Distant thunder. It was the sound of a clock starting to tick, the sky darkened by a visible shade. Rowan pushed himself off the stable wall. He walked to the door of his small sodden timber cabin. He pulled the latch and opened it, the leather hinges groaning. He did not invite them in. He simply stepped inside, into the dim interior. He reappeared a second later in the doorway, standing just inside the threshold, leaving the doorway empty. He yielded the entrance. He spoke, his voice low, dry from the dust. The inside door has a bolt. Your side. He was offering sanctuary, but more than that, he was offering them control. He was giving them the power to lock him out, or lock themselves in. Dasi understood the meaning instantly. It was a gesture more profound than any promise. She looked at the sky, a sheet of grit stinging her face. She looked at her sister, whose leg was now visibly trembling. She made the decision. She pushed Maya-Lu gently toward the cabin, with Tessa supporting her other side. Go! Tessa and Maya-Lu moved, hobbling and shuffling, their eyes fixed on Rowan as they passed him at the threshold. They disappeared into the gloom. Dasi did not follow immediately. She stood on the doorstep, a guardian at the gate. She turned, her back to the cabin, and scanned the world one last time. She inspected the yard, the stable, the path. She looked at the hinges of the door, the wood of the frame, the nail heads holding it together, as if searching for any sign of a trap. Her gaze was meticulous, absolute, satisfied, or perhaps just out of options. She turned. She did not look at Rowan as she passed him. She simply moved, a shadow slipping from the dying light into the darkness of the cabin. She crossed the threshold. The storm, held back for so long, finally broke with a howl, slamming the cabin door shut with the sound of a gunshot. Inside, in the sudden, dusty darkness, a new quiet formed. An unspoken agreement had been struck. Help would be given, but it was conditional. Boundaries had been drawn, respected, and now they were all trapped within them. The wind hit the cabin like a physical blow, a solid wall of grit and noise. Sand forced its way through every crack in the timber, dusting the floor, the table, the air itself. Inside, the world had shrunk to the yellow circle of a single oil lamp Rowan had lit. The sound of the storm was a constant, tearing scream that made conversation impossible and silence a shared burden. Rowan moved to the dry goods chest his mother had always kept, his action slow. He opened it and removed a bundle of clean linen strips, saved from an old shirt. He found a half-full bottle of whiskey, the kind he used for cleaning cuts, not for drinking. And finally, from a small wooden box, he took a spool of dark thread and a fine steel needle. He placed all three items on the rough-hewn table, in the center of the light. Then, he stepped back. 2 full paces. Tessa's head snapped up, her hand flying to the knife at her belt. Her eyes were bright with suspicion, a cornered animal's glare that dared him to take one more step. Rowan simply raised his hands, palms open, just as he had outside. He gestured to the supplies, then to Maya Lu, who sat shivering on a low stool, her face pale. He was offering the tools, not the service. Dasi watched this exchange. She gave a short nod, and Tisa's hand relaxed, though her eyes remained fixed on Rowan. Dasi and Tisa knelt by their sister. Dasi took her knife, a long, heavy blade, worn but impeccably sharp, and slit the rotted moccasin from Maya Lu's foot. As Tisa gently peeled back the soaked leather, Maya Lu hissed, a sharp intake of breath, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the stool. They began to unwrap the crude binding that was already on the ankle. It was a filthy piece of trade cloth, stiff with dried blood and dirt. As it fell away, the lamplight illuminated the injury. Rowan, watching from the shadow of the doorway, felt his stomach tighten. The ankle was grotesquely swollen, a landscape of purple and black, but that was not the worst of it. Circling her leg, just above the shattered joint, were two dark, perfectly parallel lines. They were old, the skin thickened and scarred, but their origin was unmistakable. Rope burns, healed, but permanent. It was the kind of mark a man got from a lariat, or the kind a horse got from a hobble, or the kind a prisoner got from being tied for a very, very long time. No one spoke. The three sisters shared a look that was more potent than any words. It was a shared memory of violence, a confirmation of a history that Rowan was now an accidental witness to. He understood. This injury was not an accident from a fall. It was the result of an escape. They were not just lost. They were hunted. Dasi looked up from the wound, her gaze finding Rowan in the dimness. Her voice was flat, devoid of any plea. "One night," she said, the English words tasting like ash in her mouth. "We leave at dawn." It was her bargain. Sanctuary for a few hours in exchange for their departure. Rowan met her gaze. He didn't ask who had tied her. He didn't ask where they were going. He just nodded once. Dawn. He agreed. The bargain was set. Tisa took the whiskey and, without flinching, poured a stream of it directly into the open, weeping wound beneath the swelling. Maya Lu threw her head back, a silent scream passing her lips, her body going rigid. Dasi held her, whispering something low and fierce in their tongue, a sound like a hawk's comfort to its young. As Tisa began to wrap the ankle with the clean linen, Dasi cleaned her knife on a scrap of cloth. The lamplight caught the hilt, and Rowan's eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in recognition. Carved into the dark bone of the handle was a symbol he had only heard stories about. It was not a tribal marking he recognized, but something older, a piece of the land's own mythology. It was a simple design, two sharp peaks, and a ray of light, or perhaps water, flowing from the space between them. The light between two peaks. Every farmer, every prospector, every thirsty soul in the territory knew the legend of the Twin Mesa, a place where water was said to flow from a high spring, even in the driest seasons, a place most men considered a fool's dream, a story to tell over a dying fire. But Rowan, who had studied the land until it was part of him, knew that all legends were born from a kernel of truth, and this woman held that legend in her hand. It made her, and her sisters, more than just fugitives. It made them a target. It made them the holders of a secret that men like Amos Dre, the cattle baron who claimed half the territory, would kill for. The women finished their work. The cabin was divided into two small rooms, the main room, with a hearth and table, and a small, windowless chamber at the back, where Rowan's mother had slept. Rowan picked up his blanket from his own cot. "The back room," he said, gesturing. "It has a bolt on the inside." Dasi inspected the room herself. She ran her hand over the thick wooden bolt. She looked at the floor, the ceiling. She was checking for a second way in, a way for him to betray the trust he was offering. She found none. The three of them retreated into the small, dark space. The last thing Rowan saw was Dasi's face, unreadable in the shadow. Then the door shut. The sound of the heavy wooden bolt sliding into its iron brace was loud. Even over the storm, it was a definitive, final sound, the sound of a fortress being sealed. Rowan was now the one locked out. He did not go to his cot. He went to the far wall, where his long rifle hung on a set of pegs, high and dry. He checked the load, a motion of habit, then hung it back up. It was far from his reach, and even farther from the bolted door. It was a deliberate statement. He would not be armed while they slept. He pulled a heavy three-legged chair to the front door, the one that faced the storm. He sat, his back to the room the women occupied, facing the only other way in. He draped the blanket over his shoulders and settled in for the night. Hours passed. The storm raged, a relentless assault. The cabin was an island in a sea of roaring sand. And then, through the howl of the wind, came a new sound. Rowan's mule, safe in the lean-to stable, let out a sharp, nervous bray. It was not a sound of hunger. It was a sound of fear. Rowan's head came up. He was instantly, totally awake. He listened. The wind, the sand, and then another sound, faint, the scrape of shod horses on stone. It was a sound that did not belong. No one rode in a storm like this. Not by choice. The sound was muffled, distant, but it was steady. It was not a lost traveler. It was the rhythmic, disciplined sound of a patrol. Rowan was not the only one who heard it. From behind him, from the bolted door, came the faintest whisper of movement. He did not turn. Tisa. She must have had her ear pressed to the outer wall of the cabin. A moment later, the bolted door creaked open. Just a crack. He heard a whispered exchange in the Apache tongue, too fast for him to follow. The door opened fully. Dazi stood there, the knife in her hand. She had not been sleeping. She looked at Rowan, and he saw the tension in her jaw. She inclined her head toward the outside. Kongpain Goi Kwata, she whispered, the words barely audible. Not our people. It was a confirmation of the one thing he already knew. They were all in danger. She did not go back into the room. She stepped out, a shadow in the dim cabin. She went to the bolted door and sat on the floor, her back against it, blocking the entrance to her sisters. She laid the long, bright knife across her thighs. Her eyes, open and alert, stared into the darkness, watching him, watching the front door. She would not sleep. Rowan turned back to the front. He understood. She was guarding her sisters from him and from the storm outside. He reached for the lamp, turning the wick down to a bare flicker, just enough to see his own hands. He pulled his ledger from a shelf, the book where he kept track of his seed, his debts, his meager life. He opened it to a blank page. He dipped his pen in the inkwell and wrote, the scratching of the nib the only sound besides the wind and their breathing. If they need it, he wrote, the letters dark and stark. I will show them the cedar cut. He closed the book. The doubt that had filled the cabin, the thick mane of suspicion, had not vanished. But it had changed. It had crystallized. The Mam Ngingai, the seed of distrust, had given way to something new. A thin, brittle, and desperate strand of an alliance. They were 4 people in a box, surrounded by a storm on one side and a hunt on the other. Their only shared interest was seeing the sun come up. It was all they had. It would have to be enough. The dawn that followed the sandstorm was cruel. The world had been scoured clean, leaving the air sharp and cold. The light a thin, acidic yellow. The salt cedar wash was choked with new dunes, and Rowan's half-fixed water lift was buried to its crossbeam. The silence of the morning was absolute, a heavy blanket draped over the red, wounded land. Then came the sound. It was not the call of a cactus wren or the rustle of a ground squirrel. It was the grating squeal of an ungreased axle and the rhythmic clatter of shod horses moving with purpose. Rowan was already at the door, his rifle back in his hands. He did not aim it. He held it, barrel down, resting against his thigh. From the back room, the bolt slid open. Dasi emerged, followed by Tisa and a limping Maya Lu. They moved into the shadows of the main room, away from the single window, positioning themselves like fighters in a ring, their backs to no one. Rowan looked at Dasi. Her face was grim. The bargain had been for dawn. Dawn had come, and with it, the hunters. A heavy buckboard wagon, its paint peeling to reveal the Coronado Western Railroad insignia, rolled to a stop 30 yards from the cabin. It was flanked by 4 riders. The man who swung down from the wagon seat was not a soldier. He wore a dusty black coat, a stained vest, and a dented deputy's star pinned crookedly to his lapel. This was Clay Barringer, a man who drew his pay from Amos Dre but cashed his checks with the territorial marshal's blessing. He was the railroad's law, which meant he was Dre's law. "Rowan Pike," Barringer called out, his voice oily and loud. Designed to carry, he did not approach the door. He stood by his wagon, arrogant, letting the farmer come to him. Rowan stepped out onto the porch, moving from the shadow into the weak light. He stopped, leaving the doorway clear. He did not walk toward the deputy. He made them hold their ground. And he held his... Barringer spat a stream of tobacco juice into the red dust. "Pike, you're a hard man to find, but I figured you were still scratching at this patch of hell. We are tracking 3 escaped hostiles. Apache. Seen 'em." Rowan kept his voice flat. "Seen the storm. Barringer. Not much else." A thin smile cracked Barringer's face. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. It was creased and stained, but it bore an official-looking stamp. "Well, let me improve your vision." He unfolded it, letting it snap in the wind. "Territorial warrant, issued by the magistrate at the Coronado Rail Camp. Charges theft of 6 Army rifles, 3 horses, and inciting a riot at the Railroad Survey Camp." He pointed a thick finger at the cabin. "They came this way. We tracked them to the edge of your wash before the storm hit. You harbor 'em. Pike, you're obstructing territorial law." The lie was big, and it was bold. Rowan knew what came next. Barringer would demand to search his cabin. He would find the women. He would call it proof. Before Rowan could answer, a voice came from the darkness of the doorway behind him. It was Dassie. She did not step into the light. She remained a silhouette, but her English was cold and clear, cutting through Barringer's bluster. "They sell poison water to our men," she said, her voice resonating with contempt. "They put ropes on women who say no." Barringer's smile vanished. His hand dropped to the holster at his hip. "Well, look at that. It speaks. You've got 'em. Pike, you've got 'em right there." "They came for water," Rowan said, his voice dropping low, his grip tightening on the rifle stock. "The storm hit. They're on my land." "Your land," Barringer laughed. A short, ugly bark. "This land belongs to the man who can hold it. And right now, Amos Dre holds the paper on every watering hole from here to the San Perdido. This warrant gives me the right to enter. Pike, step aside." He and his men started to move forward, fanning out. Rowan did not raise the rifle. He held up his left hand. "Stop." He did not shout. The word was quiet, but it was absolute. It stopped Barringer in his tracks. 4 paces from the porch. "This is private deeded land. Barringer," Rowan said, his voice steady. "Not railroad script, not open range. Deeded land. And this warrant," he nodded at the paper in Barringer's hand, "is for theft. It's not a writ of entry." Barringer sneered. "What are you, a lawyer now?" "Pike, a dirt farmer reading law. I read the territorial charter." Rowan said. He pointed to the porch floor by his boot. "The line is there. You cross it without my say-so. It's trespass. You try to force your way in. It's aggravated trespass. And the charter is real clear on what a man can do to defend his home against that." He wasn't bluffing. He was quoting Article 4 of the Arizona Land Act, the one clause that protected settlers from the very land barons who had written the rest of it. He had read it by lamplight until he knew it by heart. It was the only thing he truly owned. Barringer's face darkened. He knew the law. He hated it, but he knew it. He could not shoot his way in. Not in broad daylight. Not over a legal boundary. Not when the man he'd be shooting was a white farmer. It would be a legal mess Dre wouldn't want to clean up. He held Rowan's gaze, the silence stretching. The deputy's men shifted, their hands on their guns, looking to him for the order. The order did not come. Barringer slowly, hatefully, took a half-step back. He had been beaten, and he knew it. He smiled again. that thin, reptilian smile. All right, Pike, you're a lawman. I respect that. We'll honor your property line. For now. He folded the warrant and tucked it back into his coat. We'll be at the railhead by the trestle, letting this storm settle. We will be back this afternoon. Maybe with a different warrant, maybe with the marshal himself. He looked past Rowan, his voice rising so the women inside could hear. And you tell your guests, when we find 'em off your land, they ain't gonna be taken in for trial. He turned to Rowan, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. And as for you, farmer, I chua chapsa be tich through dat. Anyone who harbors them, they'll find their deed ain't worth the ink it's printed on. Amos Dre has a long memory. Pike, and he's got a very short fuse. Behringer climbed back onto the wagon seat. This afternoon, Pike, be a good neighbor. The wagon squealed as it turned, the riders falling in around it. They disappeared back over the ridge, a cloud of dust rising to meet the gray sky. Silence, thick and sour, filled the cabin. Rowan turned. The three sisters were huddled near the hearth. Maya Lou was weeping quietly, her face buried in her hands. Tisa was sharpening her knife, her movements fast and angry. Dasi stood, her back straight, but her eyes were full of a new, cold fear. He'll be back, Rowan stated. It was not a question. He'll come back with more men and a better lie. He will. Dasi agreed. The rifles, Rowan said. The warrant. It's a lie, but it's a good one. It was Maya Lou who spoke. Her voice cracked with pain and fear. It is not the rifles. It is not the horses. Rowan looked at her. It is the water, she whispered. We know the way to the Twin Mesa. Rowan felt the blood drain from his face. The legend. It was true. The spring, Maya Lou continued, the words tumbling out. The deep spring that saves the valley when the rains fail. Dre, he wants it. He wants to own it, to dam it, to sell the water to the railroad and let the rest of the valley, our people and your people, turn to dust. He wants to dock Chim, to monopolize. Dasi's expression was stony. Our father was the guide. He showed Dre's men the survey lines, but he kept the sacred places secret. They paid him, and then they poisoned him, to steal his knowledge. The final piece clicked into place. The rope burns. The hunt. The fabricated warrant. This was not a pursuit. It was an extermination. Dre was erasing the only people who knew his secret. Tisa stood up. She walked to Rowan, her eyes still holding that bird of prey suspicion. She reached into a pouch at her belt and pulled out a small, tattered piece of cured leather. It was stiff, cracked with age, marked with charcoal symbols. It was a map, or a piece of one. She held it out. Rowan looked at it. Most of it was meaningless to him, symbols of family and spirits. But in one corner, in a hand he did not recognize, someone had written 2 words in English, next to a drawing of a narrow canyon, cedar cut, and below it, an arrow pointing to a cluster of dots, Shadowgate. This is your land, Tisa said, tapping the map. Cedar cut, you wrote of it. Rowan stared at her, stunned. How? You write loud, Tisa said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. In your book, last night. Rowan looked at Dasi. Her face was unreadable. She knew. She had known he was not a threat, because her sister had been reading his private thoughts. Cedar cut, Rowan said, his mind racing. It's a dry wash, dangerous. It leads north into the Badlands. It's how my mother used to get to the high meadows, to avoid the main pass. It leads to the Shadowgate. Dasi said, it is the only way to the mesa that Dre's men do not know. A decision hung in the air, heavier than the threat of the deputy. If Rowan stayed, he would lose his farm. Dre would see to it, law or no law. If he helped them, he was tying his fate to theirs. He would become a fugitive himself. Behringer had given him an afternoon. It was not enough time. We have to go, Rowan said. Before he comes back, we have to leave before sunset. Dasi nodded, a new, sharp light in her eye. We must go, but they will follow our tracks." Rowan walked to the door and looked out. The wind was picking up again. The sky to the west was turning that sick, bruised color once more. "No, they won't," he said. "The storm is coming back. It will cover our tracks, but we have to move now." The decision was made. The cabin, the farm, the life he had bled for, was now a trap. The next hour was a blur of frantic, quiet preparation. Rowan moved with purpose. He hitched his mule, not to the heavy wagon, but to the light, two-wheeled cart he used for hauling feed. He filled every waterskin he owned, his hands working the pump at the well with a desperate energy. He threw a coil of good rope, a sack of dried corn, and his axe into the cart. Inside the cabin, Dasi was her own kind of general. She checked her sisters. She rebandaged Mayalu's ankle, pulling the linen strips tight, her movements efficient and almost tender. She stood at the door, her face to the wind, reading the sky. She sniffed the air, tasting the dust. She said, her voice low as Rowan came to stand beside her, coiling a second rope. "The dust storm will hide us." She looked at him, her gaze unflinching. "It can also kill us. It's a risk I have to take." Rowan said, "It's the only one we have." They stood there for a moment. Two captains of a desperate, sinking ship, the farmer and the fugitive. The silence between them was no longer one of suspicion, but of shared, grim understanding. Dasi looked away from the wind and at him. Her eyes traveled over his face, as if seeing him for the first time. Her voice was so quiet, he barely heard it over the rising wind. "We have never touched a white man." She paused, the admission hanging in the air, raw and strange. "And we have never asked for help. From anyone." Rowan met her gaze. He saw the pride, the fear, and the terrible cost of the words she had just spoken. He did not know what to say. He only nodded. "We best be going," he said. He helped Mayalu into the cart. Tisa climbed in beside her, her eyes already scanning the horizon, the map clutched in her hand. Dasi took the mule's bridle, her knife at her belt. Rowan took one last look at the cabin, his home. His mother's grave was on the hill behind it. He was leaving it all. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and took his place beside Dasi. Together, they turned the cart and mule north, toward the jagged, unforgiving line of the Cedar Cut, and into the teeth of the approaching storm. The entrance to Cedar Cut was a fracture in the rock, a narrow slice of shadow that promised shelter and delivered torment. They were 10 paces inside when the storm hit, not as a gradual onslaught, but as a single, solid impact. The world vanished, turning from red rock to a uniform, roaring brown. The sound was the first thing that attacked them. It was not a howl, it was a shriek, a high, thin-toothed sound like 1,000 knives being drawn across a whetstone. Sand, driven at hurricane force, did not drift. It flew in horizontal lines, striking their exposed skin like tiny, hot needles. Visibility shrank from 10 yards to 1 yard, and then to the space of a single outstretched arm. Rowan, his head down, one hand on the mule's flank, the other holding the cart steady, was blind. He was navigating by memory, by the feel of the ground beneath his boots. The world was noise and impact. Beside him, Dasi walked with her head up, as if she could see the path by sheer force of will. Her shawl was wrapped around her face, leaving only her eyes, which were slitted against the abrasive wind. Then, the ground betrayed them. The cart's left wheel, dropping into a washout hidden by the swirling dust, jolted with a crack of splintering wood. The force threw Mayalu from her seat. She landed in the sand with a cry that was stolen by the wind, a sound Rowan felt more than he heard. Rowan did not think. He let go of the cart and lunged, his hands finding her arms. She was light, a bundle of pain and terror. He lifted her, his boots sinking as he took her full weight. She was rigid in his grasp, her hands coming up to push him away. A panicked, instinctive defense. "I've got you," he yelled, his words a useless noise in the storm. "I am putting you back." He bethought. He lifted her bodily, turning and depositing her back onto the tilted floor of the cart, shoving her against Tisa, who grabbed her and held on. In that instant, That single, blurred moment of contact. He looked up. Through the screaming brown wall of sand, he saw Dazi. She had stopped, her knife in her hand. She was not aiming it at him, but she was holding it. Her eyes, visible over the cloth, were a black, unreadable void. They locked gazes. It was a moment that lasted no longer than a heartbeat, but it held 1,000 complex calculations. He saw the flash of animal fear for her sister, the automatic assumption of his violence, but he also saw, just beneath it, a flicker of something else. He had not hurt her. He had helped. It was a simple fact, and it complicated everything. An acknowledgement, a fractional thanks, immediately buried by a lifetime of hard-won, necessary suspicion. He turned away first, putting his shoulder to the wheel, roaring at the mule. "Hup, hup, now!" The mule, its ears flat against its head, brayed in terror, its hooves dancing, threatening to bolt. The small group, the cart, the mule, and the 2 walkers were about to be torn apart, scattered and lost within seconds. A new sound cut through the wind. It was sharper, clearer. It was a high, piercing note, then too low. Tisa. She had a small, polished piece of bone to her lips. A whistle. She was not playing a song. She was speaking. She sent another series of notes into the air, a command that was all rhythm and authority. The mule's head came up. Its ears twitched. The panic subsided, replaced by the dull obedience of a creature that recognized a master. Tisa whistled again, and the mule dug in its hooves, pulling the cart free with a groan. Tisa never stopped. For the next hour, she played her silent song, a constant, sharp communication that held their small, desperate group together. A single thread of sound in the overwhelming chaos. The storm was their shield. It was also their jailer. It had buried their tracks, just as Rowan had hoped. But it had also, just as Dazi had feared, buried the trail, the familiar rock formations, the shape of the canyon walls, the very path itself. All of it was gone, erased by the brownout. When the wind finally, blessedly, began to slacken, Rowan looked up, and his heart sank. The shrieking wind had faded to a low moan, the visibility returning. But the land it revealed was not the land he knew. The narrow, guiding walls of the cut were gone. They stood at the mouth of a wide, shallow basin, a perfect bowl of red rock from which there was no apparent exit. Sheer, unclimbable cliffs rose on 3 sides. They were in the dry echo basin, a box canyon, a dead end. Tisa's whistle died on her lips. Maialu, her face gray with pain, looked at the walls, and a new, colder fear entered her eyes. "Rowan," Dazi's voice was low, flat. "Where's the path?" "It should be." He pointed, then let his hand fall. "I do not know. The storm. We must have taken a wrong turn." He had failed them. "Tisa, Maialu, get down," Dazi ordered, her voice like flint. "Stay with the cart. Be ready." Before they could move, a new sound came from above. It was not the wind. It was the sound of a man's laughter. Rowan's head snapped up. High above them, on the canyon's eastern rim, a figure sat on horseback, a dark silhouette against the clearing yellow sky. Then another, and a third. Deputy Clay Behringer took off his hat and wiped his forehead in a gesture of mock relief. "Well, damn me." His voice, thin and oily, echoed, the basin amplifying every syllable. "Lost your way. Farmer, I told you we'd be seeing you." His laughter, a harsh, grating sound, bounced off the walls, surrounding them, coming from everywhere at once. They were rats in a trap, and he was the man who had just slammed the door. A rifle shot cracked. The bullet, fired from the rim, chipped the rock 10 feet to Rowan's left. It was not a killing shot. It was a proclamation. It said, "You are mine." Dazi did not panic. She was already moving. She grabbed the coil of spare rope from the cart. "Tisa, take the mule, back against the far wall. Now!" "They'll shoot us," Tisa whispered, her eyes wide, fixed on the men above. "Not yet," Dazi said, her voice a low growl. They want us alive. They want the map. She looked at Rowan. Keep them busy. She vanished, moving with a predator's silence into a jumble of boulders and scree at the base of the northern cliff. Rowan understood. He stepped forward, away from the cart, making himself the bigger target. He held his rifle, but he kept it pointed down. "Behringer," he yelled, his own voice echoing back at him. "This is a territorial matter now. You're off your jurisdiction." Behringer's laugh returned. "My jurisdiction is wherever Mr. Dre's property is. Farmer, and right now, he's got a powerful hankering for that little map you're carrying. Send it up, and I might just let you walk away." Another shot. This one was closer, kicking up dust by Rowan's boot. One of the gunmen was serious. Rowan saw him, a man in a red shirt, kneeling, sighting his rifle for a proper shot. Rowan ducked behind the cart, his heart hammering. He fumbled in his own coat pocket, his fingers closing not on a bullet, but on a small, round object. His mother's pocket mirror, the one she used for mending, the one he had forgotten was there. He pulled it out. It was a small, simple piece of silvered glass. From the rocks, a new sound, a sharp clatter of stones, as if someone was climbing and slipping on the scree field. "He's over there," one of Behringer's men shouted, pointing toward the noise. "In the rocks." Rowan saw Dazi's trap. She had tied a length of rope between two loose boulders, a simple tripwire. Then she had thrown a stone to draw their attention. "Go get him," Behringer yelled. One of the men on the rim dismounted and began a clumsy, dangerous descent down a game trail. "The rest of you, watch the farmer." The man in the red shirt lined up his shot again, this time at the cart. Rowan moved. He held the mirror up, catching the weak, watery sunlight that was finally breaking through the clouds. He angled it, the glass flashing. He found the gunman. A brilliant, blinding star exploded in the man's face. He cried out, throwing a hand up to shield his eyes, his rifle discharging into the sky. He had not been shot, but his rhythm was broken, his confidence shattered. He scrambled back, cursing. "What in the hell?" Behringer roared. "Now!" Dazi's voice came from beside Rowan. She had appeared from nowhere. She was not looking at the trap. She was pointing to the far wall. The man who had gone after the noise suddenly screamed. The rope, unseen, had caught his ankle, and he tumbled head first down the scree slope, a shower of rock and dust, landing in a heap. His leg at a broken, unnatural angle. It was chaos. Behringer was yelling at the blinded man. The other was screaming from the rocks, and for a precious 10 seconds, no one was looking at them. "There," Dazi said, grabbing Rowan's arm. Her grip was like iron. She was pointing to a dark slash in the rock, almost completely hidden by a tall, sprawling ocotillo, its thin, thorny branches just beginning to show the first hint of red flowers. It was not a cave. It was a crack, no wider than a man's shoulders. The shadow gate. "Tessa!" Dazi yelled. Tessa was already there, pulling the mule, forcing it toward the opening. The animal balked, sensing the solid rock. "Push!" Rowan yelled. He and Dazi threw their weight against the back of the cart, digging their boots in, forcing the mule and the narrow vehicle into the dark. It was a desperate, suffocating squeeze. Wood scraped against stone, the sound like a scream. "They're getting away!" Behringer bellowed from above. A volley of shots erupted. Bullets sparked and whined off the rock around the opening, sending lethal fragments of lead and stone flying. Rowan shoved Mayalu through, then Tessa. He gave the cart one last, desperate heave, and it scraped through the opening, into the darkness beyond. Dazi was already inside. Rowan dove through just as a bullet struck the rock where he had been standing. They were in a tunnel, dark and cold, and smelling of ancient dust and bats. They scrambled forward, falling over each other, until they emerged, one by one. Into the blinding light of the other side, they collapsed, a heap of exhausted, breathing bodies on the far side of the canyon. They were safe. The storm had fully passed. The air was cold, clean, and utterly still. For a long minute, the only sound was the ragged, desperate gasping of 4 people pulling air back into their lungs. Rowan was the first to sit up. He looked at Dasi. She was on her knees, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking, not from sobs, but from sheer, bone-deep exhaustion. The air was cold. He shrugged out of his heavy canvas coat. It was the only thing of value he had left. He walked over to her. She flinched as his shadow fell over her. She looked up, her eyes wide, her hand moving toward her knife. Rowan stopped. He did not step closer. He held the coat out. Then, gently, he draped it over her shoulders. He immediately stepped back. 1 full saite, an arm's length. He stood there, his hands open, giving her the space, giving her the choice. Dasi looked at the coat. It was heavy on her shoulders, warm from his body, smelling of dust and the faint, clean scent of lye soap. She did not pull it tight. She did not wrap herself in it. Her hands remained in her lap, but she did not throw it off, and she did not give it back. The cave was not a true cave, but a deep, wind-carved hollow in the sandstone, a high water mark from a forgotten flood. It offered just enough shelter to blunt the edge of the wind, which still moaned past the entrance, a wounded animal searching for what it had lost. Inside, the oppressive brown chaos of the storm had been replaced by a dim, cold quiet. The small, desperate group was slick with sweat and plastered with a fine red grit that made them look like figures molded from the rock itself. Maya Lu lay on Rowan's blanket, her breathing shallow but, for the first time, regular. The panic and pain that had twisted her features had finally receded, leaving behind a profound, death-like exhaustion. Dasi sat beside her, her hand resting on her sister's forehead. She looked up as Rowan built a tiny, smokeless fire from the dry creosote sticks he'd gathered. "The fever is broken," Dasi stated, her voice flat, as if reporting on the weather. A collective sigh, unspoken, passed through the small space. They had survived the first trial, the storm, and the chase. Now, in the stillness, the second trial began. The truth. Tessa, who had been sitting cross-legged, staring at the cave wall, finally turned. Her eyes, no longer sharp with immediate danger, were clouded with a deeper, older pain. She looked at Rowan, who was carefully measuring out a handful of cornmeal into a tin cup. "You know his name?" Tessa said, her voice soft. "Amos Dre." Rowan paused, his hand hovering over the sack. "I know the name. He runs the railroad contract. He owns the bank in San Perdido. He owns most of this. He owned our father first," Tessa whispered. Dasi's hand on Maya Lu's head tightened, but she did not speak. "Our father," Tessa continued, her gaze turning inward, "was a guide, not for soldiers, for the land. He knew the paths the water takes underground. He knew where the deer would bed in a dry season and where the bitter root grew deepest." She picked up a small, sharp pebble, and in the dust of the cave floor, she began to draw 2 peaks, a line of light between them. He was the keeper of the Twin Mesa Spring. It was his duty and his sacred honor. When the white men came, the first ones, he hid the path, but Dre was different. He did not come with guns. He came with paper. Tessa looked at Rowan, her eyes demanding he understand. "He hired our father, a contract, to show his surveyors the safe passes, to keep them from the bogs and the dry canyons. He paid in new coin and in good flour. Our father believed it was a fair trade. He believed he could protect the mesa and also provide for his people." She stopped, the pebble crushing the drawing into meaningless dust. "Dre's men were friendly. They laughed, they shared tobacco, and for a year, all was well. Then, last spring, they asked him to guide one more survey, a special one, just for Mr. Dre, to find a new pass for the cattle. They said, our father went. He was gone for 10 days. When he came back," Tessa's voice cracked, and for the first time, Rowan saw the bright, sharp girl replaced by a grieving child. "He came back sick, a sickness of the gut, a fire that burned him from the inside. The railroad doctor looked at him and said it was bad water. But our father had drunk from that same water for 50 years. It was not the water. Dasi finished the story, her voice a cold, hard stone. It was poison, slow. So he would have time to talk, to bargain for the cure that was never coming. They sat by his bed. They offered medicine. All he had to do was draw the final map to the spring. He refused. He held on for 3 days, and then he died. Her gaze lifted from her sister and met Rowan's. They took the map from his pouch, but it was the one he showed them, the false one, the one that leads to the dry echo basin. Rowan's blood went cold. Behringer's trap. It was our father's trap, Tisa said with a flash of bitter pride. And we were the only ones he ever told. We have the true map, the one he kept in his heart, and that he gave to us. The silence that followed was heavy, weighted with murder and betrayal. Rowan looked down at his own hands, calloused from the plow, stained with the red dirt. They were in farmers' hands, honest hands. I signed a contract, he said, the words tasting like grit in his mouth. Dasi's head snapped toward him. With the Coronado and Western, he continued, unable to stop. Last season, a contract for hay, 100 bales, to feed their survey mules. He looked up, his gaze meeting Dasi's. I took their coin. I thought it was just business. Just hay. I did not know. He was looking for understanding, perhaps for absolution. He received neither. Dasi's expression did not change. She simply looked at him, her eyes holding that impossible depth of loss. Thought no one could be saved. She said, the Vietnamese words were soft, but they landed like a hammer blow. He did not understand the language, but he understood the tone. It was not anger. It was not pity. It was a statement of fact, as cold and clear as the water they were all desperate to find. Believing, she said, translating her own thought into her blunt, hard English. What you believed. It saved no one. It fed the mules that carried the men who poisoned my father. Rowan flinched. The truth of it, the simple, direct line she had drawn from his farm to her father's deathbed, was irrefutable. He had been a part of the machine, an ignorant part, but a part nonetheless. He said nothing. He could not. He stood up, his throat tight. He walked to his belt, which lay coiled with his rifle. From it hung a small, leather-sheathed knife. It was his skinning knife, the one his own father had given him. Its handle was worn smooth, shaped to his palm. It was his most personal, most useful tool, aside from his rifle. He unclipped the sheath. He walked over to Tisa, who watched him with a wary, new suspicion. He knelt, not in front of Dasi, the leader, but in front of Tisa, the sentinel. He held out the knife, hilt first. Tisa looked at it, confused. I fed them, Rowan said, his voice hoarse. Now, I am with you, but you do not have to believe me. He pushed the knife into her hand. Her fingers closed around it, startled. You decide. You decide when, or if. I get this back, he said, using the few words of their language he had heard. He had disarmed himself. He had given a hostage. He had placed his trust and his life in her hands. Tisa stared at the knife, then at him. Dasi watched, her face unreadable. But her eyes were alive, alert, seeing this new, strange move in a game she did not understand. Tisa looked at her sister. Dasi gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Tisa slid the knife into her own belt. The tension in the cave did not break, but it changed. It was no longer a taut wire of suspicion. It had become the complex, interwoven knot of a shared and very dangerous fate. The silence that returned was softer. Maya Lu slept on, her breathing deep and healing. Rowan returned to the fire. He took the small tin cup and dipped it into the water skin, careful not to spill a drop. He placed it on the hot stones at the edge of the fire, to heat it for his cornmeal. Dasi watched him. She did not watch his face. She watched his hands. She saw the broad, strong palms. She saw the calluses, thick and yellow, from the hammer and the plow. She saw the old, white scars from wire, and the fresh, red scratches from the ocotillo at the shadow gate. They were hands that knew work and pain, but as she watched him move the cup, his motions were slow, steady. He did not grab, he did not strike. He moved with a deliberation that was almost gentle. They were the hands of a man who builds, who mends, not the hands of a man who takes. An hour later, as the light in the cave mouth began to turn from gray to a deep, bruised purple, they prepared to move. "We go at night," Dazi said. It was not a suggestion. Rowan nodded, pulling the tattered map fragment from his pocket. "This Palo Verde wash. It's the right way. It's low ground, sheltered from the ridges. They won't be able to see us from above. We can make the base of the mesa by dawn." "The dark is a shield," Tisa agreed. "But it is blind. How will we move? How will we talk?" Dazi looked at Rowan. She held up her hand. "A fist. This," she said, "is stop, or danger. You see it, you freeze." Rowan nodded, making a fist himself. She flattened her hand, palm down, and swept it toward the earth. "This is down, or hide. You see it. You are on your belly. No questions." He mimicked the motion. She brought a single finger to her lips, then pointed. "This is listen, or water." For 10 minutes, they practiced, a silent, grim ballet in the fading light. Stop, hide, listen, go. The simple, brutal language of survival. When it was time, Tesa and a much stronger Mayalu went first, slipping out of the cave mouth like shadows. Rowan slung his rifle, checking its load, and gathered the remaining supplies. Dazi waited for him. She was holding his canvas coat. He had forgotten it, had left it by the fire. He was shivering now, the cold of the high desert night sinking into his bones. He reached for it. "Thank you." She did not hand it to him. Instead, she stepped closer, into the space he had so carefully kept between them. He stood still, his heart suddenly loud in his chest. She opened the heavy coat, and with the same slow, steady hands he had used at the fire, she lifted it and placed it onto his shoulders, pulling the collar straight. It was the same gesture he had used on her, but inverted, a mirror image. She did not say, "Thank you." She did not need to. Her gaze, when it met his, was no longer the sharp, flinty glare of a hunter, nor the cold assessment of a prisoner. It was something new. It was softer. It was, perhaps, the first time she had truly seen him. She nodded once, a quick, business-like gesture. "We go." They stepped out of the cave into the twilight. A new boundary had been set. He was no longer the dangerous stranger. He was, for now, a conditional ally. And as they set out, following the dark, winding path of the Palo Verde wash, he knew that their lives, all of their lives, now depended on what those conditions would be. The Palo Verde wash was a river of shadows, and they were its current. They moved in the dark, following the deep-cut channel, the sand silencing their footsteps. The air was cold, sharp in their lungs. After hours of walking, the walls of the wash fell away, opening into a wide, flat plain. And there, against the star-dusted horizon, it stood. A colossal, skeletal silhouette, the San Perdido Trestle Bridge. It was a monument to progress, a spiderweb of raw timber and black steel stretching for 1/4 of a mile, high above the dry, white bones of the ravine. Rowan stopped, his hand automatically flying up in the stop danger signal. Dazi was already frozen beside him, her head tilted, listening. The only sound was the high, thin whine of the wind through the wooden supports. Then Rowan saw it. He almost tripped over it. A single, thin strand of iron wire, no thicker than a whip snake, ran along the sand at the base of the embankment. It was taut, humming with a vibration he could not hear but could feel. "Signal line," he whispered, his voice snatched by the wind. "Telegraph. It connects the railhead. To that," he pointed. A small, windowless shack, little more than a box, stood at the near end of the bridge, a coil of wire beside it. It was from there they would send the signal for the transport. Darcy nodded, her eyes tracing the wire. "They are here." It was Tisa who spoke, her voice a low, urgent hiss. She had crept back from a forward scouting position, her moccasins making no sound. "I was closer," she whispered, her eyes bright with what she had learned. "I heard them. Berenger, he is not just waiting for men. He is waiting for a wagon from the junction. He said—" She looked at Rowan. "He said, the judge will see our proof at dawn. He has a box, the evidence. He brings it tonight. He will be at the junction court by morning to make legal the seizure." The pieces slammed together in Rowan's mind. The fake warrant, the trap at the basin, and now, this. Berenger was not just a thug. He was the key. He was carrying the legal weapon Dre needed to steal the land. All of it, right out from under them. Rowan looked at the bridge, at the dark shack, at the single thread of wire. They were trapped. They could not outrun a telegraph signal. They could not outrun a warrant presented at dawn. "We can't get to the mesa," he said, the words tasting like ash. "Even if we do, Dre will own it by noon tomorrow. He'll have the law, the real law, on his side." Dazi's hand went to her knife. "Then we stop the signal. We kill the man who sends it." "And then what?" Rowan countered, his voice desperate, his mind racing. "They will send another, killing Berenger. It only proves what he said about you is true, that you are murderers." He grabbed her arm. "No, not with blood." He pointed at the wagon parked near the shack. A heavy, covered transport vehicle. "He has a box. You heard Tisa. He has evidence. Paper. That's what the judge needs to see." Rowan looked from Dazi to Tisa, his plan forming, sharp and terrible. "So we changed the evidence. We don't need to fight them. We don't need to shoot. We just need to make sure that when Berenger gets to the judge, his box is empty, or it has the wrong papers." He corrected himself, his voice hardening. "No, we steal it. Just lost the paper and they can't present it to court. If the papers are lost, he has no case. He can't show them to the court." Darcy stared at him. The farmer was not a fighter. He was something else. She saw the tactical brilliance of it. A theft. A simple, clean, and devastating countermove. "It's guarded," she said, her voice shifting. "All business." "2 men," Tisa said, her voice sharp. "At the wagon. Berenger is in the shack, drinking. I saw him." Dazi nodded. The plan was set. "Mayalu, you are our eyes. From that ridge." She pointed to a high dune. "One flicker of the mirror if they move. One. Tisa, you are our voice." Tisa smiled, a thin, sharp expression. "The coyotes here are very loud tonight." Dazi looked at Rowan. "You and I. We get the box." The next 10 minutes were a lifetime of pure, cold tension. Mayalu, her leg throbbing, scrambled up the dune, Rowan's small mirror in her hand. Tessa melted into the rocks to the east, 100 yards from the bridge. Rowan and Dazi moved as one shadow. They did not crawl, they flowed, using the deep ruts of the wagon path, the black pools of shadow cast by the bridge itself. The 2 guards were lazy, their backs to the path, huddled around a small, contained fire, a flask passing between them. Rowan's heart felt like a drum against his ribs. This was not farm work. This was the edge of the world. A sound, high and lonely. Split the night. A coyote, calling for its mate. One of the guards looked up, annoyed. "Damn animals! Sounds like it's right on top of us." The call came again, this time from behind them, to the south. Tisa was moving, throwing her voice, creating a perimeter of sound that was both everywhere and nowhere. "Spooky," the second guard said, pulling his collar up. He stood, peering into the darkness. It was the opening they needed. Dazi was at the back of the wagon, her knife already slicing the leather strap that held the canvas flap. Rowan was beside her. They slipped inside. It was dark, smelling of oil, canvas, and new rope. And there, on the floor, a single, metal-banded footlocker. Rowan grabbed one handle, Dazi the other. It was heavy. 90% of the plan was done. They had it. They backed out of the wagon, silent, the box between them. They were 5 steps away, in the deepest shadow of the bridge piling, when the door of the shack flew open. "Damn it!" Clay Behringer's voice slurred. "Dropped my blasted lighter. Must have been when—" He was walking right toward the wagon, his head down, fumbling in his pockets. He was 10 feet away. 5. He looked up. He did not see them clearly. He saw a dark shape. He saw the box. "Hey!" he bellowed, his hand dropping to his gun. "Hey, stop thieves!" He fired. The shot was wild, the bullet screaming off the iron band of the bridge support. Rowan did not run for the rocks. He ran for the bridge. "This way!" he yelled, pulling Dasi with him. They scrambled onto the wooden tracks, a maze of timber and iron. Behringer was right behind them, his boots thundering on the planks. "Stop 'em! They've got the box!" The guards were shouting, firing into the darkness. It was a nightmare chase. The wooden planks, slick with frost, rattled and groaned under their feet. The wind howled, trying to rip them from the exposed structure, through the gaps in the planks. Rowan could see the dry, rocky ravine floor, a terrifying 70-foot drop, gleaming white in the starlight. "The middle," Rowan panted, shoving the box. "The central pillar, we can't—" They reached it, a wide, solid platform of cross-cut timbers, a dead end. Behringer skidded to a halt 10 paces away, his chest heaving. He raised his pistol, the barrel looking like a cannon in the dark. "End of the line. Farmer," he sneered. "Give me the box." Rowan looked around, desperate. His eyes landed on a thick coiled rope, a heavy maintenance line, looped over a high beam. As Behringer steadied his aim, Rowan did not grab the box. He grabbed the rope. With all his strength, he seized the entire coil and threw it down, over the side, into the black emptiness of the ravine. The rope unspooled with a sound like a giant bullwhip, a rushing, hissing sound. The heavy, thick line dropped past Behringer's feet, the end of it, thick as a man's arm, slapping the plank near his boot. Behringer screamed. He stumbled back, his eyes wide with terror. Looking down, he thought it was a snake, a trap. He thought Rowan was trying to pull him over. His aim was gone, his balance shattered. In that single, chaotic moment, Behringer was exposed. His side was turned. He was fumbling, off balance. Dasi was there. Her knife was in her hand. Her arm was back, coiled, her body tensed to strike. She was 3 steps from him. She could kill him. She could end the man who hunted her, the man who served her father's murderer. Rowan saw her. He saw the clean, lethal line of her body. He saw the decision in her eyes, a dark fire, and he saw her stop, her body poised to kill, relaxed. Her arm, the one holding the knife, lowered. She let out a breath, a small, sharp puff of white in the cold air. She shook her head, almost imperceptibly. No killing when not necessary. It was her law, her survival, but it was, most of all, her choice. "Now, Rowan!" she yelled. Rowan did not hesitate. He shoved the heavy file box into her arms. "Go!" As she turned and ran, vanishing into the maze of timbers, Rowan grabbed the still swinging rope. He kicked off the central pillar, using his farm boy strength, and swung, not down, but around the terrified, confused deputy. He landed on the walkway on the other side, his boots slamming the wood. He ran. He didn't look back. He followed the shadow that was Dasi. They leaped from the trestle onto the soft sand of the embankment, just as the guards, finally realizing what had happened, reached the bridge. They regrouped with Tessa and Mayalu, and they did not stop running for a mile. They finally collapsed in a deep, sandy wash, a mile from the bridge, safe in the blackness. Rowan, his lungs on fire, clicked open the latches on the box. He used his mother's small mirror to catch the starlight. It was not evidence. It was the prize, a beautiful, hand-drawn map of the Twin Mesa, showing the deep spring, a thin ledger book with names, dates, and amounts Dre's bribery payments, and at the bottom, a stack of blank warrant forms, all pre-signed, and a small, brass stamp with a crude, forged territorial seal. They had it all. They had the proof. Rowan looked up, gasping for breath. Dazi was on her knees, her head down. He reached out a hand to help her up, to steady her. She took it. Her grip was strong. And as he pulled her to her feet, he felt it. Her hand was trembling. He stared at their joined hands. She was shaking. He looked up at her face. Her eyes were not on him. They were on his hand, the one holding hers. His own hand was shaking, too. A small, ragged breath escaped her lips. It was not a sigh of fear. It was the first, true, shared breath of relief. They were alive, and they had won. They found their sanctuary in a high, shallow alcove eaten into the cliff face, the mesquite overhang. It was a place the Ancient Ones had used. Evident from the faint, soot-blackened stone at the back, it offered a wide view of the plains they had crossed, and a roof, but little else. The wind, though weaker here, still found them, carrying the cold, sharp scent of the high desert night and the dry, sweet smell of the mesquite that gave the place its name. There was no wood for a fire. Not here. It was too exposed. They huddled in the darkness, a small, exhausted knot of humanity. The moon, a new, razor-thin crescent, gave no light to speak of, only a faint, silvery blue wash that made the stars seem brighter and the shadows deeper. Tisa and Mayalu, their strength utterly spent, fell into a deep, restless sleep, huddled together for warmth, the stolen ledger box their pillow. Rowan and Dazi sat apart, their backs against the cold sandstone. Listening. They were listening for the sounds of pursuit, for the distant, angry shouts of Beringer. But the night offered only the rustle of the wind and the pounding of their own blood in their ears. Rowan could feel the adrenaline draining from his body, leaving behind a deep, aching cold and a tremor he could not stop. He looked at his own hands in the faint starlight. They were still shaking. He looked at Dazi. She was not looking at the plains. She was staring at her own hand, which rested, palm up, on her thigh. A thin line of dark blood, black in the moonlight, ran from her knuckle to her wrist. A scratch, deep from a splintered beam on the trestle. She had not even registered the wound until now. Rowan stood, his joints cracking. He moved to the small supply bag they had salvaged from the cart. He pulled out the whiskey bottle, now mostly empty, and a strip of the clean linen. He walked to her, his steps slow. He knelt in the sand in front of her. She did not flinch, but her entire body went rigid. Her eyes, which had been distant, snapped to his, sharp and alert, the pupils wide in the dark. Rowan stopped. He did not reach for her. He stayed where he was, on one knee, and held up the bottle and the cloth, a silent offering. He saw her gaze drop from his eyes to his hands, then to the cloth, then back to his eyes. She was assessing, calculating. He tilted his head, a small, questioning motion. He whispered the words, so low that Tisa and Mayalu would not stir. Duak Chu. May I? He was not asking permission to heal her. He was asking permission to touch her. For a long moment, she did not move. He saw the struggle in her face. It was the conflict of a lifetime. To accept help was to show weakness. To accept contact from him was to cross a line she had defended with her life. Slowly, deliberately, she turned her hand and held it out, palm up, her consent given. Rowan moved closer. He did not sit. He remained kneeling, a position of suppliance, not dominance. He poured a small amount of whiskey onto the linen. The sharp, alcoholic smell cut through the clean scent of the desert. This will sting, he whispered. I know, she whispered back. He looked at her one last time, his eyes asking again. She held his gaze. She did not nod, but she did not pull away. He brought the cloth to her hand. The first touch was a shock, a jolt like a spark in the cold air. Her skin was not soft. It was like his, calloused, strong, warm. He moved slowly, his touch deliberate, cleaning the long scratch with a clinical, almost reverent care. She hissed, A sharp intake of breath as the alcohol bit into the wound, but her hand did not move. He was gentle, but firm, his thumb bracing her palm while his fingers worked the cloth. He was aware, intensely aware, of the proximity. He was closer to her than he had been to any person in years. He could feel the warmth radiating from her body, a stark contrast to the cold stone at his back. He could see the fine, dark hairs on her forearm, the pulse beating in her wrist, strong and steady, beneath his fingers. He finished, the wound now clean, a stark red line against her skin. He kept holding her hand. He did not know how to let it go. She did not pull away. She was staring at their joined hands, her breath held. "We," she said, her voice so low it was almost lost to the wind. "Never touched a white man?" Rowan froze. He looked up, meeting her gaze. Her eyes were not angry. They were something else, lost, afraid. "We have never touched a white man," she repeated, the English words tasting strange. "We have never wanted to. They are the ones who take." She looked down again. "Until now?" Her voice was a bare whisper. She struggled for the words. "What scares me? It is not your color. It is not your hand." She looked up, her gaze raw, vulnerable, a look he had never seen in her. "It is the choice, to lose the choice. It is what they do. They take the choice away. My father, my sister." Rowan felt the truth of her words settle in his own chest, heavy as stone. He understood. He finally, truly, understood. He let his own gaze soften. He did not try to reassure her. He did not lie. "Every choice is yours. Dasi," he said, his voice as quiet as hers. And with that, he proved it. He took a clean, dry strip of linen and placed it, along with the roll of bandage, directly into her free hand. He put them in her grasp, giving her the tools. Then, slowly, deliberately, he released her. He let go of her hand, breaking the contact, and sat back on his heels. He had given her back the choice. The space between them was electric. He had yielded. He had offered, and he had retreated. The next move, the next choice, was hers. Dasi looked at the supplies in her hand. She looked at her wounded hand, now cold, tingling where his fingers had been. And she looked at him, kneeling in the sand, his hands now open and empty at his sides. Watching her, he had not taken, he had given, he had not demanded, he had offered. Slowly, as if moving a great weight, she put the supplies down in the sand, and just as slowly, she reached out. She placed her wounded hand, the one he had just cleaned, back into his. It was not a gesture of healing. It was not a gesture of need. It was a statement, a choice. "Rao." My breath caught in his throat. He did not grab her hand. He simply let his fingers curl around hers, accepting what she offered. He watched her face. It was as if a mask, one she had worn for so long she had forgotten it was there, was dissolving. The hard, tense muscles in her jaw, they unclenched. Her shoulders, which she held as straight and rigid as a rifle barrel, lowered. They slumped, just a fraction. But it was the most profound surrender he had ever seen. And her eyes, which had always darted, assessing threats, or been held, a wall of defiance, they simply rested. They held his, and for the first time, she was not looking at him. She was looking at him. He moved, not with speed, but with the same slow deliberation she had. He leaned forward. She did not pull back. He did not aim for her mouth. He aimed for the space between her eyes. He pressed his forehead, rough with grit and sweat, against hers. He closed his eyes. He felt her breath, warm, on his face. They stayed there, for 1 second, for 10, for a lifetime. Two people, in the dark, in the cold, simply breathing. It was an intimacy more profound than any touch. It was a shared, silent. We are here. We are alive. When he pulled back just an inch, his eyes opened. Hers were still closed. He saw the dark, thick line of her eyelashes against her skin. He moved his head. She must have felt the motion, the intent, because her lips parted, just slightly. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of arrival. He pressed his mouth, dry and chapped, to hers. It was slow. It was restrained. It was firm. It was a seal on the bargain they had just struck. He tasted the dust, the salt, the faint, metallic tang of fear, and beneath it all, the simple, unbelievable warmth of her. It lasted no more than a single, shared breath. It was more than any words they had ever spoken. It was less than any demand. When he pulled away, her eyes opened. They were dark, deep, and clear. He did not let go of her hand. The cold was a real thing, a predator. He sat beside her, their shoulders and hips pressed together, sharing the small, insufficient warmth of his body and his coat. She leaned into him, her head eventually, after a long, silent struggle, coming to rest on his shoulder. He did not put his arm around her. He simply held her hand. They huddled for the rest of the night, a single shape in the darkness. He did not know if they slept. He only knew that, at some point, his breathing, ragged and fast, had slowed, and it had found the same rhythm as the woman breathing beside him. He focused on that, and on the solid, real and chosen pressure of her hand in his. It was the only thing in the world that was real. A high, cheerful whistle, a perfect imitation of a canyon wren, shattered the gray light of dawn. Rowan's head snapped up. Dasi jolted awake, her hand flying to the knife that was not there. They were stiff, cold, and sore, their legs tangled in the blanket. Tisa was standing over them, a wide, knowing, and utterly merciless grin on her face. Rowan's knife was still tucked in her belt. She was twirling a piece of straw between her fingers. "A good sleep," she chirped, her voice full of laughter. "The sun is high, the rocks are warm, and I think—" She looked pointedly at Dasi. "Our leader. Hour is late." Rowan felt a hot blush creep up his neck. Dasi, for the first time, looked flustered. She scrambled to her feet, brushing the sand from her dress, her hair wild, her face flushed. We were watching," Tisa finished, her grin widening. "I know. A very, very close watch." From behind Tisa, a new sound came, a soft, breathy chuckle. Maya Lu was leaning against the cave wall, her face pale, but her eyes were bright. She was smiling. It was the first time Rowan had ever seen her smile. It was a small, weak thing, but it was real. Rowan got to his feet, offering a hand to Dasi. She took it, pulling herself up. They stood side by side. The tension of the night was gone, replaced by the awkward, bright light of morning. Tisa's teasing had broken the spell, but it had also, in its own way, solidified it. They were not just fugitives and a farmer. They were not just a man and a woman. They stood, in the new day, as comrades, as survivors, and, as they looked at each other, a quick, shared glance before they turned to the work of the day, they both knew, without ever needing to name it, that they were something more. San Perdido Junction was not a town. It was a scar, a collection of raw pine shacks, muddy streets, and canvas tents, all existing to service the Coronado Western Railroad. The largest wooden structure, the only one with a real plank floor and glass windows, was the Territorial Land Office, which doubled as the courthouse. They arrived just as the sun cleared the eastern ridge. Walking the last mile, Rowan, Dasi, Tessa, and Maya Lu. They were not fugitives. They were plaintiffs. They walked side by side, a strange, grim delegation of 4, with Rowan carrying the heavy metal ledger box. The courtroom was already full. It smelled of wet wool, stale tobacco, and nervous sweat. On one side, packed together, were the railroad men, surveyors, and hired guns, their faces hard and confident. On the other side sat a scattering of small ranchers and local homesteaders, their expressions worried, their hands clutching their hats. They were the ones whose land was also on the docket, their claims being reviewed by Dre's legal machine. At the front, at a heavy oak table, sat Amos Dre himself. He was a big man, not with muscle, but with presence, poured into a fine black suit. Beside him, his lawyer, a thin man with a face like a weasel, shuffled a mountain of papers. At the other table, Clay Barringer sat, his thumbs hooked in his belt, his dented star polished for the occasion. He was smug, relaxed. He had not yet heard the news from the trestle. He was expecting an easy morning. Then he saw them. Barringer's smile did not just vanish. It was ripped from his face. His color turned from a healthy red to a pasty, sick gray. He half rose from his chair, his hand flying to his gun. A motion of pure, panicked instinct. "What in the hell?" "Mr. Barringer, you will be seated," a voice like rolling thunder commanded. At the front, behind a tall desk, sat Judge Titus Reeves. He was an old man, with a beard like white wire and eyes that had seen too much. He was a territorial judge, which meant he was part lion, part politician, and all authority. He banged his gavel once. "This is a court of inquiry, not a saloon. Your sidearm will remain holstered, or you will be removed." Barringer sat, but his eyes, wide with disbelief and a new, dawning terror, were locked on the box in Rowan's hands. "Judge Reeves." Amos Dre's lawyer stood, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "We are here to file for seizure on abandoned properties, as per the Territorial Act of 1872. We have our evidence of dereliction and native interference. We were not aware the court would be entertaining local theater." The railroad men chuckled. Judge Reeves looked over his spectacles. "The court will entertain anyone who walks through that door with a claim. Mr. Harris, the docket is open. Who are you?" he said, pointing at Rowan. Rowan stepped forward, placing the heavy box on the judge's desk with a solid, definitive thud. The room went silent. "My name is Rowan Pike. Sir, I hold the deed on Salt Cedar Wash, and I am here to present evidence regarding the claims filed by Mr. Dre." "Objection," Harris squeaked. "Mr. Dre is not. This is a railroad matter. Mr. Dre pays the railroad's bills," Rowan said, his voice clear and strong, carrying to the back of the room. "And this box contains his receipts." A murmur went through the crowd. Dre's face, which had been bored, was now a mask of controlled fury. "Mr. Pike," the judge said, his eyes on the box, "that is a serious accusation. What is in this container?" "The real evidence, Your Honor," Rowan said. "The proof Barringer was meant to deliver this morning before we recovered it." Barringer shot to his feet. "Lies, he stole. They attacked the trestle. They're murderers." "Then I must be a ghost," Rowan said, turning to him. "And you seem to have misplaced your evidence box, Deputy." The judge banged his gavel again. "Silence, both of you." He looked at the three women, who stood just behind Rowan, their faces proud and still. "And who are these ladies?" Rowan stepped aside. Darcy stepped forward. She did not look like a fugitive. She wore Rowan's canvas coat, but she wore it like a mantle. Her head was high. She placed her hands on the rail of the judge's desk. She spoke, and her English, though accented, was as clear and cold as a winter spring. "My name is Darcy. I am of the people of the Twin Mesa. We are not murderers. We are the ones who were hunted. We are here to name our accusers." She turned, her gaze sweeping over Dre and Barringer. "These men, Your Honor, do not want land. They want our water. They want the sacred spring. To get it, they sent men to our camps, not with food, but with Bon Han Ban Ruu Dok Cho Danta. They sold poison whiskey, the kind that burns the gut and blinds the eyes. They did it to make our men weak, to make them talk." The homesteaders in the back were leaning forward. This was a story they had not heard. Darcy's voice, which had been cold, now burned with a low fire. "And when the men were sick, they came for the women. They put ropes on women who would not go with them." Her gaze fell on Barringer. Barringer exploded. "Objection, this is nonsense. It is the unsworn, uncorroborated testimony of a savage. It is a loi kau vokan kukua dan moiro, a baseless accusation. It has no place in a court of law. A savage." A new voice, sharp and high, cut through the room. Tisa stepped forward. She was holding something small, something that glinted in the morning light. "Is this the property of a savage?" she asked, her voice ringing with contempt. She placed a metal object on the judge's desk. It was a silver-plated lighter. "We found this on the San Perdido trestle last night, dropped by a man in a hurry." Berenger's hand flew to his vest pocket, his face a perfect picture of horrified recognition. Tessa was not finished. She pointed to the scratched, ornate initials on the side. "C.B." she read, loud and clear. "Clay Berenger." Then she pointed to the bottom. "And this? What is this?" She scraped at a reddish-brown smear on the bottom with her fingernail. "It is red wax, the same red wax." She pointed to the forged warrant Rowan had placed on the desk. "That was used with this Dalgia." She held up the small, brass seal, the forgery stamp. He dropped his lighter while he was faking his evidence. The room was utterly silent. The weasel lawyer, Harris, was staring at Berenger with open hatred. Berenger was ashen. "And as for the other accusation," a third voice said, this one soft and full of pain. Mayalu stepped forward. She was limping heavily, leaning on Tessa. She looked not at the judge, but at a man in the front row, a man with a black bag at his feet. "Dr. Harris, the town physician?" "Doctor," she said, her voice trembling, but holding. "Mr. Berenger calls my sister a liar. He says there were no ropes." She bent with a wince of pain and hiked up the hem of her buckskin dress, just enough to show her ankle, still swollen, still wrapped in Rowan's linen. "Not this," she said. "This is new. But this," she pointed with a shaking finger to the scarred, parallel lines above the swelling, the old, dark, permanent marks. "This is from his rope, from the railroad camp, where I was tied for 4 days. Ask the doctor. Ask him if a rope can do this." Dr. Harris, a good man, looked at the wound. He looked at the old, scarred tissue. He looked at Berenger, and his face was set in a mask of pure disgust. He did not say a word. He just nodded, once, at the judge. That was when Amos Dre, the man who owned everything, the man who never spoke, lost control. He saw his empire, his plan, his future, dissolving in this dusty room, dismantled by a farmer and 3 native women. He surged to his feet, his face a purple mask of rage. "You fools!" he bellowed, his voice a roar that shook the windows. "You are all fools. You talk of law and proof. There is only one law out here." He slammed his fist on the table, scattering papers. "Whose stream is stronger?" The room froze. The Vietnamese words, spat with such venom, were a mystery, but the tone was not. Harris, the lawyer, grabbed his arm. "Amos, no." Dre shook him off. "That spring belongs to the man who is strong enough to take it. It belongs to the man who will use it. Not a bunch of superstitious savages or dirt-scratching farmers. It belongs to me." His admission, loud and public and undeniable, hung in the air. The railroad men looked down. The homesteaders looked at each other, their fear turning to a new, cold anger. Judge Reeves just watched him, his face grim. "Mr. Dre, you have just simplified this proceeding immensely." "And he wrote it all down," Rowan said, his voice quiet in the sudden vacuum. He opened the ledger, the one from the box. "Bribes, payments to the territorial surveyor, payments to Deputy Berenger. It's all here, Your Honor. The map, the bribes, the forgery. This is the evidence he was so eager to present." It was over. Judge Reeves banged his gavel. "Deputy Berenger, you are stripped of your office. You and Mr. Dre are remanded to the custody of the territorial marshal, who I see is already in the back of my courtroom. Thank God." 2 uniformed men stepped forward, moving toward a stunned Dre and a non-resistant, utterly defeated Berenger. "All land claims, seizures, and inquiries related to the Coronado Western Survey are hereby canceled, pending a full investigation," the judge declared, his voice booming. "This court is adjourned." The room exploded. The railroad men, silent, leaderless, filed out, avoiding eye contact, But the homesteaders, the small ranchers, the people who had come in expecting to lose everything, they did not move. They looked at each other, at the judge, and then at the four figures at the front. A single man in the back, a farmer with hands as calloused as Rowan's, began to clap. A slow, steady, powerful sound. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the room was filled with applause. It was not a polite sound. It was a roar of relief, a sound of the tide turning. Rowan looked at Dussie. Her face was calm, but her eyes were on him. She was not smiling, but there was a light in her gaze he had never seen before. A warmth that had nothing to do with the night before, and everything to do with the public, sunlit moment they were in now. It was respect. It was gratitude. It was partnership. In the front row, an old woman, a Yaqui matriarch who had sat through the entire proceeding without a single change of expression, leaned over to her companion. She nodded toward Dussie, who was now being shyly thanked by a rancher's wife. "Chief's judgment," the old woman said, her voice a dry rustle. And it was. The news, as it always does in the desert, traveled faster than a horse. It flew from the junction, past the trestle, past the dry echo basin, past the burnt-out shell of Rowan's farm. It traveled on the wind, carried by traders and mule skinners, until it reached the deep, hidden refuge of Canyon del Toro. By nightfall, the elders of Dassie's own community, the people of the Twin Mesa, had heard. They had heard how the daughter of their murdered guide had faced the white man's law, and won. A message was sent, a rider, fast and silent, carrying a single eagle feather. The council was convening. They were summoning the three sisters home. Canyon del Toro was not a place on any white man's map. It was a sanctuary, a deep, green-bottomed canyon carved by a living creek, hidden from the world by a fortress of sheer, red rock. It was the heart of Dassie's people, and it was where they had returned. They were met not as fugitives, but as heroes. Their arrival was quiet, marked by the silent, profound relief of their kin. But the victory at the courthouse, as told by the riders, had set a new task before them. The council convened 2 days later, not in a building, but under the ancient, spreading branches of a cottonwood tree that was old when their grandfathers were born. The air was cool, smelling of damp earth and wood smoke. Rowan had been invited. He was the first white man to ever stand within the canyon's walls in a time of peace. He stood at the back, separate but present, his hands clasped behind him, a silent witness. Dassie, Tessa, and Maialu sat before the 5 elders. 3 men and 2 women, their faces maps of the land itself. The eldest, a man named Alo, spoke first. His voice was a dry rustle, like leaves. "You have done what your father could not," he said, his gaze on Dassie. "He saved the secret. You saved the people. The charge against Dre is strong. The territorial marshal has sent word. The old map, the false one, is all they will ever have." He leaned forward, his dark eyes intense. "But the spring at Twin Mesa is now a different kind of prize. It is not just a secret to be hidden. It is a power to be shared and to be protected. The white farmers at the junction, they now see us as allies. They are thirsty. They will look to us. The community needs a new voice, a new guardian." He looked at Dassie, and his voice firmed. "We ask you, daughter of the last guide, to be the new one. We ask you to be our Nguoi Dan Nuak, our waterkeeper, to guard the spring, to speak for the mesa, and to be our bridge to the outside world." A silence fell over the grove. It was the highest honor. It was also a chain. It was a life sentence of duty, binding her to the rock, to the water, to the people. It was everything her father had been. Dassie sat, her back straight, her hands in her lap. Her gaze was not on the council. It was on the dust at her feet. Before she could speak, a new voice, quiet and hesitant, spoke up. Elders. All eyes turned. Maialu, who had spent her life in the shadow of her 2 stronger sisters, was looking at the council, her hands twisting in her lap. "Maialu," Elo said, his voice softening. "You have a word." "I do," she said, and her voice, though quiet, was steady. I have a word. She took a deep breath. I was tied, I was hurt, and I was healed. First by my sisters, and then by a white man's medicine. She nodded at the linen bandage, which she still wore, a badge of her ordeal. Our people, they are sick, not just from poison, from wounds that do not heal, from the coughing sickness, from children lost to fever. She looked up, and her eyes, for the first time, were not filled with fear, but with a new, clear purpose. At the courthouse, I saw Dr. Aris, but on the ride here, I heard of another, the new I.C. Mexico, the healer woman in Santa Neva, the one who uses the old herbs, but also the new ways. I wish to go to her. A gasp went through the crowd. Santa Neve was a week's journey. I wish to learn, Maya Lu said, her voice stronger now. I do not have my sister's strength, or my other sister's eyes, but I have hands. I want to learn to heal, to bring that knowledge back, to mend our people. The council stared, astonished. Maya Lu, the broken one, was offering to be their mender. Alo looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, a slow, deep gesture of respect. A good path, little sister, a strong path. It will be so. Before the murmur could die, Tisa spoke. She did not ask. She stated, I will not be the waterkeeper, she said, her voice sharp, cutting. The water is too slow. It stays in one place. She stood, her body a coiled spring of energy. I am the one who moves. I am my father's eyes. I will be the Matvatai, the eyes and ears. I will take the maps, the real ones. I will scout the trails. I will watch the railroad. I will know where our enemies are, before they know we are there. That is my duty. That is my choice. Alo nodded again. As it should be. He turned his gaze, heavy with expectation, back to the eldest sister. Two paths are chosen. One remains. Dasi. Dasi felt the weight of every eye, the gaze of her people, her sisters, the elders, and from the back, she could feel, like a physical touch, the gaze of Rowan Pike, her choice. It had come to this, the sacred spring of Twin Mesa, the duty to her father's legacy, the future of her people, or the man who had seen her, the man who had touched her, the man who had given her back her own choice, duty or heart. She looked up, and her eyes found his. Across the distance, he was not looking at her with hope or with need. He was just watching. His face was calm, his hands still clasped. He saw her dilemma. He saw the trap. And then, before she could ask the question that was tearing her apart, before she could make him the center of her choice, he spoke. His voice was not loud, but it carried in the still, cool air, respectful, but clear. Elders, he said. The council turned. Surprised. Forgive me, I have no place here, but I have a word. For her. Before she answers. He looked at Dasi. He did not move from his spot, but his gaze crossed the distance, and it was as intimate as their touch in the dark. Dasi, he said, his voice low. This is your choice, not mine, not ours. He took a breath. If you choose Twin Mesa, if you choose this life, I will go back. I will rebuild my farm. I will plant barley. He gave her a small, sad, and utterly selfless smile. And every time the wind blows, I will know it comes from this direction. I will know it has passed you. And I will smile. It will be enough. He had done it. He had released her. He had taken the unbearable weight of his own heart out of her hands. He had given her a gift more precious than the water itself, a choice, clean and free of debt, of... Dasi felt a sudden, sharp sting behind her eyes. He was a fool, a brave, good, and true fool, and she loved him for it. She looked at the elders, she looked at her sisters, and she looked at him, this farmer who had, in 3 days, remade her world. She did not answer. I must ask for time, she said, her voice thick. I must go to the mesa. I must walk, alone. Alo nodded. The choice is great. It demands solitude. Go, we will wait for dawn. The walk to the twin mesa was one she had known since childhood, but she had never walked it like this. She moved through the night, her feet finding the path, her heart a tangled knot. She reached the spring just as the stars were at their brightest. It was not a gushing fountain, but a simple, clear pool, emerging from a crack in the rock, cold and pure, before slipping back underground. It was the lifeblood of the desert. She sat, her back against the same stone her father must have leaned against. She touched the rock, the ancestral stone. She laid her cheek against it, feeling the cold, ancient strength. "Father," she whispered, "what do I do?" She was torn. To choose the mesa was to become a monument, a guardian, a solitary, sacred thing, just like this spring, to be revered, to be respected, and to be alone. It was to lose Rowan, to choose Rowan. It was impossible. She could not, to leave her people, to abandon the duty her father had died for, to turn her back on the water. It would be a betrayal so profound it would poison any happiness she might find. It would make her a stranger to herself. She could not have one, without losing the other, and she could not bear to lose either. She sat for hours, the cold of the rock seeping into her bones, matching the cold in her heart. The wind sighed through the rocks, and she thought of his words. "I will smile." He would smile. He would endure. He would let her go, and he would build a life from the loss. But could she? She touched her lips, remembering the feel of his, the taste of dust and safety. She touched her hand, the one he had held, the one he had cleaned, and she thought of his hands, the builder's hands. A new thought, a seed, began to form. Why was it a choice between two things? Why was it or? Why not and? She looked at the spring. It did not just sit in its pool. It emerged, it flowed, and it gave life. Before returning to the earth, it was a cycle. It was a connection. It was not a fortress. "We don't need to lock up a heart," she whispered, the words coming to her, clear as the water. She stood. The sky to the east was turning a pale, pearly gray. She had her answer. She returned to the canyon just as the first light hit the rim. The council was assembled. Her sisters were there, and Rowan stood in the same spot, his face weary, having not slept, waiting for the verdict. Dasi walked to the center of the grove. She was no longer torn. She was calm. She was a leader. She looked at the council. "I have my answer. It is a great honor, but I will not be your water keeper." A murmur of shock. Elo's face fell. Rowan's heart, despite his promise, broke. "Not in that way," she continued, her voice strong, cutting off the dissent. "You ask me to be a guardian, a bridge, but you ask me to be a stone, to sit here and to hold. I am not a stone." She looked at her people. "We need someone to guard the water, but we do not need to lock up a heart." "Dasi," Elo began, "this is our way. Then our way must change." She said, "The world has changed. The railroad is here. The farmers are here. Hiding is not enough. We must build." She laid out her plan. The water keeper, it should not be one person for life. It should be a duty, in rotation, a cycle, like the seasons. She looked at Tisa. "My sister will be our eyes. She will tell us when it is safe." She looked at Maya Lu. "My other sister will be our hands. She will heal us." "And I," Dasi said, "I will be the hands that build. I will accept the duty, but I will be the first of the new guardians, not the last of the old. And in my first cycle, I will not just guard the water, I will share it." The council stared, dumbfounded. "Share with them." Elo gestured to the world beyond the canyon. "With the ones who are thirsty." Dasi said, "With the ones who stood with us, we will dig a new channel, a small one, a shared one, from the lower spring, a pact built of stone and water. It will flow to the farmers of the Salt Cedar Wash. It will flow." She looked at Rowan, "to the farm of Rowan Pike, and in return, they will be our allies, our partners. Their crops will be our crops. Their fight. Our fight. She turned, and she walked. For the first time, not to the council, but to Rowan. She stood before him, in front of her entire community. She took his calloused, builder's hands in her own. "And I am not leaving myself," she said, her voice soft. For him. She looked him in the eyes, her gaze full of a fierce, unbending love. "I choose both." She held his hands tighter, with real work. Rowan looked at her, his face filled with a slow, dawning miracle. He saw her plan. He saw its beauty, its danger, and its sheer, impossible brilliance. He saw, in her, not just the woman he loved, but the leader she was. He brought her hands to his lips and kissed her knuckles. "Then we had best get started," he said. "It is a long way to dig." He turned, with her, to face the council. They stood together, a new, unbreakable unit. Alo looked at the two off them. He looked at the hope in Tisa's eyes, the purpose in Maya Lu's. He saw the future. He stood, a slow, creaking motion, and he bowed his head. "A new pact," he said, "a new way. It is a good choice. Waterkeeper." The Salt Cedar Wash, which had been a place of dust and despair, was now a place of pilgrimage. The ceremony to open the new channel was not a grand affair, but it was the most important event this land had ever seen. It was a clear, cool morning, the air so clean it seemed to magnify the sound. The homesteaders, their faces washed clean of their usual worry, stood on one side of the newly dug, stone-lined ditch. The people of the canyon stood on the other. It was the first time in memory the two had gathered, not for a tense trade or a fearful parley, but for a celebration. Rowan Pike stood at the head of the channel, at the simple, sturdy wooden sluice gate he had spent a week building. Beside him stood Dasi, the waterkeeper. Her hair was not wild, but bound in two simple, strong braids. She wore her own buckskin, but over it she wore a new sash, one woven by the elders, marking her new duty. Elo, the elder, stepped forward and laid his hand on the wooden lever. He looked at Rowan and nodded. Rowan placed his hand on the lever, next to the elders. Then Dasi placed her hand on top of both of theirs. A collection of children, both Apache and white, who had been watching from a safe distance, crept closer, their eyes wide, together. The three of them the old ways, the new ways, and the bridge between them pushed, the lever creaked, and the gate slid open. For a moment, nothing, and then it came. Water. It was not a flood, but a clear, steady, musical flow. It was the water from the lower spring of Twin Mesa, guided by Tisa's maps and carved by the hands of two communities. It filled the ditch, the sound of it, the simple, beautiful sound of running water, silencing the crowd. It gurgled and splashed, a sound the wash had not heard in a generation. A single high-pitched whoop came from one of the settler children. Then an Apache boy laughed, and the spell was broken. The children ran, following the water as it made its way down the channel, their shouts a mix of two languages, their joy a single, shared sound. Hands, which had been clasped behind backs or tucked nervously into belts, began to unclench. A rancher, the one who had started the applause in the courtroom, walked across the dried dirt and offered his hand to one of Dasi's cousins. The handshake was firm, and it was real. The pact was sealed. Later that afternoon, when the small celebration had quieted, Rowan and Dasi were at the edge of his rebuilt farm. The cabin was larger now, with a foundation of stone and a porch that faced east, toward the mesa. The first precious trickle of water was flowing into the cistern he had dug. In their hands, they held two young cottonwood saplings, their roots balled in wet cloth. They walked to the head of the new channel, just beside the sluice gate. "A symbol," Rowan said, his voice quiet. He used his shovel to dig the first hole. "For a long life, for deep roots, and for shade," Dasi said, kneeling, her hands in the dark, damp earth. "For those who come after." They planted them side by side, their hands meeting in the soil as they firmed the earth around the fragile trunks. They did not speak. They did not need to. They were building. This was their new language. The sun was a fire-red smear, bleeding into the horizon when they returned to the cabin. The new water in the cistern cast wobbling, golden reflections on the fresh-cut pine of the porch. The wind, when it came, was no longer dry and abrasive. It was cool, and it carried the scent of damp earth and, from the head of the channel, the sharp, clean smell of wild mint. Rowan had a pot of coffee on the stove. Darcy stood at the porch rail, watching the last of the light paint the twin mesa a deep, rosy red. He came to stand beside her, handing her a tin cup. She took it, her fingers brushing his. It was a simple, casual touch, but it held all the new, comfortable weight of their life. She turned to him. The light from the lamp inside the cabin caught her face, softening the strong lines of her jaw, illuminating the warmth in her eyes. She did not drink. She set the cup down. She reached out, her movement slow, and placed her hand, not on his arm or his shoulder, but flat against his chest, right over his heart. He could feel the warmth of her palm through the thin cotton of his shirt. "Do you feel that?" she whispered. He put his own hand over hers, holding it there. He just nodded, his throat too tight to speak. "We used to say," she said, her voice a low, intimate murmur, just for him. "Never touched a white man." She looked up, her gaze holding his, her eyes deep and clear. "I said, we had never touched. We had never wanted to. I thought the fear was of the touch, of the hand that takes." Her fingers moved, just slightly, feeling the steady, solid beat of his heart beneath her palm. "I was wrong," she whispered. "It turns out the scary thing isn't touching, but being touched right." "It was not the touch that was frightening," she said. "It was being touched in the right way." Rowan's hand moved from hers. It slid around her waist, pulling her gently, inexorably closer. "And is this the right way?" he asked, his voice rough. For an answer, she slid her other hand from his chest, up his shoulder, her fingers lacing into the hair at the nape of his neck. She pulled his head down. The kiss was not like the first one. In the dark, born of fear and desperation. This one was slow. It was deep. It was certain. It was a kiss of arrival, of a promise kept, of a home found. It was a long, slow claiming, a sealing of the pact they had made with the land. He tasted the coffee on her lips, and the wild, clean scent of her, and he knew he was, for the first time in his life, no longer alone. She pulled back, just an inch, their foreheads resting against each other. They were both breathing, a little unsteadily. He felt her mouth curve into a smile against his. "You won a great wager, farmer," she murmured. "And what did I win?" he murmured back. "The rest of your life," she said. He chuckled, a low, warm sound, and kissed her again. A laugh shared between them, the quiet, joyful sound of two people who had survived a long, hard drought and had finally found their rain. Inside, the cabin was warm. The single oil lamp on the table cast their shadows, large and intertwined, against the wooden walls. The shadow of his hand, on her back, the shadow of hers, in his hair, the two forms merging, moving as one. The wind picked up outside, rustling the new-planted cottonwoods. But inside, there was only stillness. A curtain was pulled, a window was closed, the lamp was turned down, and the cabin was left to its own quiet, holding only the gentle sounds of cloth brushing against cloth, of two low voices, speaking in a mix of two languages, whispering each other's names, and the new, steady, shared rhythm of their breathing in the dark. The next morning, the sun was bright, the light sharp and clean. Rowan was on the porch, splitting wood, when two riders came up the new channel path, Tisa, on a fast pony, and Maya Lu, sitting taller than he had ever seen her, on a mule borrowed from the village. "Ho, water-keeper!" Tisa shouted, reining in, her eyes dancing with mischief. "You sleep late. The water will run away if you are not careful." Darcy emerged from the cabin. a braid half finished in her hand, a small, exasperated smile on her face. "I am awake, little sister, and I see your eyes are open. But are they useful? You missed the part where I was already at the cistern." Maya Lu laughed, a real, full-throated sound. She had a new bag at her hip, a gift from Dr. Aris, full of supplies. She was leaving for Santa Neve in an hour. "She is right. Tessa, her watch is better than yours." Tessa just grinned. "We bring news. From the junction." Dasi turned serious. "What news?" "A rider came through," Maya Lu said, her smile fading, replaced by a sober joy. "The territorial court has reviewed the case. The judge in the capital, he has seen the ledger. Amos Dre and Clay Behringer, they have been indicted. For fraud, for conspiracy, for depraved indifference to human life. And the railroad," Tisa added, her voice sharp with satisfaction. "They have been fined. A big fine, $10,000. And they are Buok Boy Thuong, ordered to pay reparations. To your farm, Rowan, for the lost crop, and to our people, for the poison." It was a true, final, and just end. The sisters stayed for one more cup of coffee. Then Maya Lu began her journey south, to learn. Tesa began her journey west, to watch, and as the sun reached its peak, Rowan and Dasi, their work for the morning done, walked from the cabin. He reached for her hand. She took it. They walked along the bank of the new channel, the one they had built. The water flowed beside them, a silver ribbon in the red dust, a testament to their shared future. Above them, high and eternal, the twin mesa stood, its rock glowing like a warm, red ember in the light. In the clear, moving water at their feet, two faces were reflected. They were no longer filled with fear. They were no longer searching. They were just home. They had never touched until they learned how to keep each other. And the land, because of it, was also kept. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We are so glad you are here. We would love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below. Share your thoughts, and let's build this community together. If you enjoyed this tale, please show your support by subscribing to Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and if you really want to help us, smash that hype button to help this story be heard by more people, just like you.